In this lecture, I'm going to go over 10 different tips for working in Photoshop. Now, you don't need to know these, but they make your workflow much faster. So if you want, you can go ahead and skip ahead. If not, let's go ahead and stick around and go over these 10 tips. So the first one is how to merge and make a copy of all of your layers so that you don't lose all of these. You want to make a copy of it. So what we'll do is, starting up here on this top tree layer, I'm going to go ahead and hit the keys Control, Shift, Alt, and then E. And if you're on a Mac, it's going to be Command, Shift, Option, E. And then you'll see right over here in your layers panel that it just made a copy of all of these layers down here and merged them together. So if I go ahead and turn all these layers off, you'll see that this top one is still on, and so we can still see our image, which is a merged copy. If I go ahead and turn that off, now it's all gone. So that's very useful for making quick copies and merges of all of your layers to see how it looks together, or if you need a merged copy. Next, we're going to go over the rotate tool. So by hitting the letter R on your keyboard, you'll see that you can now click and rotate like so. Now, why would you want to do this? Well, this is very useful when you're drawing or trying to trace out a shape and you need to do a side or a horizontal line. So when it's like this, it's very hard to just draw a line straight across like so. And if you ever tried to draw a line straight across like this, you know it's very hard. But if you can go ahead and rotate your workspace, or if you're drawing with paper and pencil, you can rotate your paper, and now it makes it much easier to draw that line because now it's vertical. Now, to get it back to the proper position that we had it placed at before, all you have to do is go ahead and hit Reset View, which is up here at your top bar. So I'm going to go ahead and hit that, and that'll put it back to 0, 0. The next tip is how to change the opacity of an entire layer. So if I wanted to change the opacity, which is how transparent my layer is, and I wanted to do it for this tree, usually what you would have to do is you'd have to come over here to the layer. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this merged layer off. In fact, I'm just going to go ahead and delete it to make things easier. And then I'm just going to go ahead and come to my opacity tab right here, and you'll see if I drag that down that my tree becomes much more transparent or see-through. Now, this can be a little bit time consuming if every time you need to change the opacity of a layer, you have to come all the way over here and change it like so. So a really quick and fast way you can change it is just by hitting the numbers on your keyboard. So before you do this, you want to make sure that you have your grab and move tool selected. So once you're on that tool, we can go ahead and hit the number 2 on our keyboard, and you'll see that'll bring that layer down to 20% opacity. So 2 equals 20%, 3 would equal 30%, and so on and so forth. So if I go ahead and hit the number 6, well, now that brings that up in opacity, so it's less see-through. If I hit 0, that'll make it completely opaque, and you can't see through it at all. Now, if you wanted to get a number in between, so let's say, for example, 75%, well, there's not a 7.5 key on your keyboard. So the way you would do that is you would go ahead and hit 7 and 5 in a rapid procession. So you go 7, 5 like so, and then that sets that to 75% opacity. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and set that back to 0. The next thing we're gonna go over is how to move up and down in your layers panel. So over here in your layers panel, rather than having to click up or down when you want to change layers, a really quick way you can also do that is you can go ahead and hold down Alt or Option if you're on a Mac, and then you're going to hit your square bracket keys. So if I hit that, you'll see it'll move all the way down to the bottom, and if I continue that, it'll move all the way back up to the top. And if I move over to my left square bracket, it'll move down. So right square bracket moves up and left square bracket moves down. The next tip we're going to go over is how to add steps to your history. So over here, this little icon right here with an arrow and 3 squares, if we go ahead and hit that, you'll see that this shows all of our history, which is the history of our moves in Photoshop. Now, you can use these to undo, but you only get so many. But you can set this as high as you want in the preferences. So right now, we have it set to, I think, 50. But let's say that you wanted to be able to undo up to 100 moves. That means if you were to paint 100 strokes, you would be able to undo all of those. So the way you do that is by coming to Edit, then coming down to Preferences, then we're just going to come up to General, then we're going to come down to Performance, and then right over here where it says History States, you'll see we have it set to 100. So I was incorrect. I thought we were set at 50, but it's actually 100. But you'll see here you can go ahead and hit this down arrow, and you can bring this up to as high as you want or as low as you want. So I'm going to leave that at about 50. And the thing to note about this is the more of these you add, the slower Photoshop will go, because while you're working, it's going to have to hold all of that history in. So if you have anything over 100, it's going to cause your computer to go very slow. I recommend that you keep it at 50 unless you're really worried about having to step back in your work. So that's how you change how many steps are in your history log. I'll hit OK. Next, we're going to go over how to use the Snap To tool. Now, the Snap To tool is very, very useful, and let me show you what it is. So let's say that we wanted to take this layer down here that has these floating sort of islands. Well, I'm going to switch over to that layer, and you'll see if I use my grab and move tool and move it to over here, all these purple and pink lines start appearing. So these are marking positions in our document that we might want to move these to, and it automatically will snap them to those positions to help us. So let's say that we wanted to center this. So if I drag this over here, you'll see now it snaps right into the center, and I can see that pink line right in the center of my document. Now, how do you get these Snap To lines? Well, the way you do that is by coming up to View, then you're going to come down to Snap To, and you want to make sure that you have guides, layers, and document bounds all checked. And that's going to make those purple lines appear as you move layers around and help you snap things into place. Next, we're going to go over the color blend mode. So the color blend mode is a blending option that you have on your layers that you can use to change the colors of objects in your work. So for example, let's say that we wanted to change the color of this floating tree trunk right here to more of an orange red, so this color right here. Well, what we can do is we can go ahead and add a new layer above that layer. So there's our tree trunk layer. We'll add a new layer above it. And then what we want to do is we just want to fill that in. And I'm not going to take my time to make this perfect, but if you were going to actually change the color of this tree trunk, you would want to make sure that you either take your time to paint over it, or you would want to use a clipping layer mask, which would be much quicker and probably better. And all a clipping layer mask is it's a mask that clips everything outside of the shape of your object. And you'll see what that is here in a few more tips. So once we have that all filled in, next what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and change the blend mode. So over here on our layers panel where it says normal, if we go ahead and hit that down arrow, you'll see that we get all these different options for a blend mode. So if we come all the way down to the bottom where it says color, we can go ahead and select that. And now you see it applies that red color to the image beneath it. So all of our values still come through, but the only color we see is the red color because that's being applied to the layer beneath it. Next, let's go over how to duplicate objects in your document really quickly. So let's say that we wanted to duplicate this tree trunk. Well, what we can do is we can hold down Alt or Option if you're on a Mac, and you want to make sure that you're on your grab and move tool. So holding down Alt or Option, I'm going to go ahead and click this and drag it away, and you'll see that makes an automatic copy of that. I can go ahead and drag another one over, and you'll see over here in our layers panel that it's making those all on different layers. So if I go ahead and select all three of those, what I can do now is I can go ahead and drag a copy over of each one of those layers. So this is extremely useful for making quick copies. Next, let's go over how to shut off all layers except for one that you want to view. So let's say that we wanted to turn off all of our layers except for this tree layer right here, and that's the only thing we wanted to see. Well, what we can do is we can go ahead and hold Alt or Option if you're on a Mac, and then you're going to go ahead and hit the eyeball icon next to that. And you'll see that'll quickly turn off all of these layers down here. That way you don't actually have to go in there and manually turn them all off. It quickly turns them all off for you. And if you want to turn them back on, you just hold down Alt or Option once again, and then you hit your eyeball, and that will turn all of those back on. So that's also a very useful, quick tool in Photoshop. Now, the last thing we're going to go over is how to create a quick clipping layer mask. So what is a clipping layer mask? Well, let's go over that right now. So let's come back down to our red color layer, and if I go ahead and use my brush tool, and I'm going to enlarge the size, I'm going to go ahead and brush way outside of the shape of my tree trunk. So you'll see we have red coming all the way out over here and all the way over here. Now, what if we only wanted that color within the shape of our tree trunk? Well, we can use something called a clipping layer mask. Now, you could right click it and create a clipping layer mask, or you could come up to Layer and then come down to Create Clipping Layer Mask. But an even quicker way to do this is to hold down Alt or Option if you're on a Mac, and then don't click, but just hover in between the two layers you want to create a clipping layer mask for until you get this box with a down arrow. Then you can go ahead and click with that right in between those, and now you'll see that it applies it to that layer. Now, I thought that this was above this layer right here, but it wasn't. It's right above that one, and so it's being clipped to that layer. If I wanted to, I could go ahead and drag this down to my original one, which I believe is this one right here, and then I'll have to do that again. So hold down Alt or Option and hover between the two of them until you get that little icon, and then click. And now you see that that actually gets clipped within that shape. So this is also a very useful tool in Photoshop. All right, that brings us to the end of this lecture. So in this lecture, I gave you 10 tips on how to work faster in Photoshop. I really hope you found this lecture to be useful and helpful, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next one.